Welcome to This Old Democracy, a regular podcast where we explore the ideas, movements, and people working to rescue our faltering political system and rebuild American democracy on a stronger, more inclusive, and truly representative foundation. I'm your host, Micah Sifry, and I've been on this beat for a long time, from taking on the problem of money in politics, to writing a book about third parties, to tracking how the internet keeps shaking things up, and more recently, joining the fight against rising authoritarianism. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Center for Ballot Freedom, a cross-partisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy. Our guest today is Jennifer Dresden. She's the author, along with Deborah Apau, of a new white paper titled Fusion as a Pathway to Proportional Representation, Lessons from Global Experience and American Electoral Heritage. It is scholarly and it is urgent, a combination that makes me excited about today's show. A little bit more about Jennifer. She's a policy strategist at Protect Democracy, where she helps teams leverage leading social science research to inform their work in defense of democracy. She was previously a member of the faculty and the associate director of the Democracy and Governance program at Georgetown University. She holds an AB from Harvard, an M. Lit from the University of St. Andrews, and a PhD from Georgetown. Welcome, Jen, to This Old Democracy.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here.
We're glad to have you. So we're recording this show in the last week of September, and by the time it drops, your paper will have just been released, and it'll be available on the Protect Democracy website, protectdemocracy.org, and we'll also include a link to it in the show notes. But why don't you give us the big picture first? You know, your paper, as I've read it, argues that proportional representation, or just PR, can strengthen democracy in the United States by loosening the grip of the two-party system. So there are a lot of ideas there. And for our listeners who may be new to all of this, why do you think that our current winner-take-all system creates problems, and how would PR address them?
Sure. So I think it might be helpful to start with the recognition that there's a lot of different ways of doing democracy, right? Lots of different forms, lots of ways to structure elections and all the rest. If we zoom out, though, what we really want, and I think this lines up very well with the whole purpose of this show, right, is that we want a democracy that's representative and that's responsive and accountable and that's resilient. And the system that we have now, winner-take-all elections, really is not giving us that. A lot of your listeners are probably familiar with what that means, what winner-take-all means, but it might be helpful just to sort of lay it out. Most legislative elections in the U.S., particularly at the state and at the federal level, run using a winner-take-all system and single member districts. And what that means is basically just that, as with voting for your member of Congress, you are in a district that's represented by just one person. And on election day, everyone in the district gets together, casts a vote, and whoever gets the most votes wins. And it doesn't matter whether you win by 40 points or a tenth of a point, that person gets the seat and the other side gets nothing. And sort of the words of Talladega Nights, right? If you're not first, you're last. And that kind of electoral system, not just in the United States, around the world, but especially in the United States, it lends itself to a two-party system. And that helps to create a really binary us versus them kind of politics. And that creates problems for a bunch of reasons. First, it just contributes to poor representation in general, right? We are a big country with diverse views. People in our country come from all different kinds of backgrounds, have all different kinds of experiences and preferences. And when there's only one seat in play in any district, elections will always favor the two biggest parties. And it's very hard for anybody else to get a chance to break through, which means a big part of that diverse set of desires and preferences and ideas doesn't get represented. But it's also very us versus them, right? And that exacerbates polarization and it contributes to escalating extremism. Because election after election is sort of a contest between the same two teams, and the margins can be really close. And so that raises the stakes, and it gives politicians both an opportunity and an incentive to do everything they can to get an edge and to win. So something like gerrymandering is a much bigger problem in winner-take-all systems. And so you get both poor representation as a system, but you also get this sort of very divisive, hard-nosed politics that ends up being really vulnerable to takeover by extremists. Because a well-organized faction can use those dynamics to take over one party. They don't have to take over the whole system. Just by taking over one party, they're already occupying, say, half the political space. And so that's where sort of winner take all puts us. Proportional representation is an alternative, right? It is a different way of running elections. And with PR, instead of electing just one person per district, you would use multi-seat districts. So several people are getting elected all at once. And the way you do that is to allocate votes proportionally to reflect the total pool of voters in that district. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. I don't think we have 6 hours to get into all the different versions of PR. But a lot of the time, what you're doing is sort of allocating seats based on share of votes. So if one party gets 50% of the vote, they're going to get 50% of the seats. A party that gets 25% of the vote under winner take all would get nothing. But under proportional representation, they would get 25% of the available seats. So it's just a different way of doing elections. But when we think about what this means for democratic health, first, having multi-member districts actually makes elections more competitive because it opens up room for more challengers. And we see this in the United States, right? So just a ridiculous number of our congressional seats are not competitive, just to take one example.
Yeah.
Depending on the election, it's what, like 80% of seats are safe.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
That's not only not representative, it also doesn't create very good incentives for officials to be responsive to their constituents, right? So when more parties have a shot at winning the seat, they're going to have more incentives to be responsive to voters. They're going to recruit higher quality candidates. It's just going to be a more vibrant system in general. But PR also tends to lead to systems that are more resilient because they don't fall into that kind of us versus them politics, right? Instead of the same two teams competing for everything all the time, you get coalitional politics. You tend to get agreements and cooperation in that way, in ways that are fluid over time. So a party that's, in the opposition coalition today, tomorrow you might be allied with them, right? You might need them. That can shift, that can move. And so politics isn't quite as existential, right? It tends to take the temperature down because you don't really want to paint the guy as sort of like an ogre, right? If 2 years from now, you might actually be having to govern with him. The other thing that it does do, though, from a slightly more sort of hard-nosed perspective in a way, is it gives pro-democracy leaders more options for how to handle authoritarian or extremist factions. So there are a lot more ways to kind of box those factions out because you have more options for partners, right, to create that coalition. So your option isn't marginalize the extremists and lose power or embrace the extremists and keep power. You have more options than that. And we see this all the time in countries like Belgium and in Finland. There are just a lot more different strategies that pro-democracy leaders can employ, right, that help build the resilience of the system because it's less restricted in that way because of the multi-party nature of the system.
And also, I think in the American context, one of the things that seems attractive is that it would, what a lot of people feel right now is that neither party excites them, that there's a lot of negative voting. You vote against the other party rather than for the one that you're so excited about. The trend seems to be that people are not registering as Democrats or Republicans. They're registering as independents, but they're not that doesn't coalesce into anything because there's no other viable party for them to identify with, or that would be trying to organize them. So, and then you have the people who are just like, the hell with it, I'm not even going to bother to vote. None of those things are healthy, is I think what I'm hearing you say, and that this would invigorate the general experience of a typical voter. They'd have more choices.
Yeah, yeah, I think it operates at both levels, right? Voters would
Mhm.
have more choices. They would have a way to participate in politics that would be more authentic,
Mhm.
right? That maybe wouldn't require a full examination of conscience before going to
Hmm.
the ballot box to sort of decide which between your two options that you don't like you're going to
Yeah.
sort of
Hold
accept.
your nose and vote for. Yeah.
Right, right. And so there are more ways to be involved. That leads to sort of a reinvigorated enthusiasm. It leads to more participation in that way. So from the perspective of voters, yes, it has all of these benefits for the health of democracy. And it also has these other benefits of, from the sort of political or elite level, it also sort of opens up the strategic world a little bit.
Hmm. Hmm. So in your report, you draw on a bunch of international examples as case studies, other countries that adopted proportional representation after having been, like the United States, first past the post, winner take all systems. Which of those examples, New Zealand, South Africa, Belgium, et cetera, which one do you think offers the most relevant lessons for us now?
Yeah, so I think the entire constellation of cases offers lessons.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at them sort of in total, you can see patterns across the set. And I'll just sort of highlight three.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of different ways that countries have adopted proportional representation. Lots of different ways reform can succeed, but there are three things that we kind of saw pop up again and again
Mm-hmm.
that preceded that reform effort. One is being popular discontent with the existing system,
Yep.
right? That's perhaps unsurprising, but it is common. The second thing is that we see a weakening of dominant parties' sort of hold and grip on the political landscape. And we do often see some kind of disruptive shock to the system that creates a reform opportunity. You don't always have to have all three in any given case, but each of them, is these are three things that each of them can make it more likely that you'll see reform. And so in that context, I think New Zealand actually provides a lot of really great lessons. Not
Mm-hmm.
just because it's more recent than some of the other cases that we looked at in the paper, but also because I think it's a really great illustration of how movement and energy for change can build from a place of people really just believing that their system should be fair, right? And their vote should
Mm-hmm.
matter, and that their leaders should be accountable to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
because the New Zealand
Hey,
case, it's really interesting, right? Starting
yeah.
going,
Say more about that.
the 19.
Yeah. I went back into my library and did a little, a while back, tried to get myself through a book about how New Zealand went to PR. And I think the reason why I agree with you that the New Zealand example is worth looking at more closely, because I think a lot of people are perhaps listening to this conversation and saying, dream on, my friends, dream on. It'll never happen here, because the system we have now seems so entrenched. And yet it has happened in other places where two-party systems were pretty entrenched too, right? So that's the New Zealand, a good reason for New Zealand. It's also the most recent, right? I think they shifted to PR in the 1990s. It's not that long ago, and they seem to like the new system pretty well. So, what else? What else can we glean from this to allow us to dream realistically, and not just fantasize about a change that will be too hard to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things about politics in New Zealand in the 1970s and 1980s when sort of the movement for PR really got started
Mm-hmm.
that would, I think, feel familiar to a lot
Mm.
of Americans. In particular, the grip of the two major parties there, I think, is is very real. Because you did have quite a few minor parties in New Zealand in 19, even before the 1970s, but in the 1970s and 1980s, you regularly had minor parties that were actually getting substantial shares of the vote, like like 10, even 20%. But they weren't getting nearly as many seats in the legislature as that vote share should have entitled them to, right? One would think. So in one election, you get a minor party that gets almost 21% of the vote, and they get 2% of the seats.
Wow.
In the legislature. And that's a feature, not a bug, of winner take all systems, right? They disproportionately allocate seats to the bigger parties. And the thing is, though, that even because of this distortion, even the major parties were affected by this. And I think this is something a lot of folks maybe don't know about New Zealand, is you actually had elections where a major party would get a majority of the seats and control of the legislature, even though nationwide the other major party had gotten more votes.
Yeah.
Right. So this was a problem for the major parties as well. And very understandably, I think people looked around and said, wait, what is this?
Yeah.
Right? Why are our elections working this way? And at the same time, so you start to see a little bit more energy for reform, thoughts of, let's join most of the rest of the democratic world and use a more proportional system. And at the same time, you had these governments that were being elected in these bizarre ways, also adopting some pretty unpopular policies, right? So not only was this, theoretically, we think things should work this way, also the way politics is operating doesn't seem aligned with what people want. So by the late 1980s, the Labor Party actually runs on a promise of reform, right? To some folks' surprise during the campaign, the leader says, yeah, we'll, there's been a commission. They've made a report on what reform could look like. We'll have a referendum. They then don't do that. Right? They do not have a referendum. And in the next election, right, the other major party, the National Party, kind of calls them out on this and promises that they'll be the reformers, and they do win, right? They also kind of try to weasel out of wholesale reform. They sort of try to go halfway. But that public pressure sort of keeps on. People still really want more reform. They want a different way of doing things. And so eventually they do have to put it through a series of referendums. NPR passes, and it goes into effect in 96.
And those major parties still have a role in New Zealand. It's not like they've been eliminated as a result of embracing this change.
Yeah, and I think that that's the thing. One of the lessons that we see from a lot of cases is it's not as if the major parties disappear, right? They still often play very strong leadership roles in the post-reform political landscape. It's just that there's room for more parties, and that changes the dynamic. It shifts the style and the tone of politics in important ways, and it shifts what it means for voters to participate in politics.
So your paper has a really fascinating claim, though, which is that fusion voting could be the pathway to achieving proportional representation in the United States. And now we really have to unpack that. I mean, we have talked about fusion voting a few times on this podcast, but let's just assume for argument's sake that someone is hearing this for the first time and, needs a little primer. What is it? Why did it matter historically? And why do you think reviving it could help pave the way to full-scale proportional representation in the United States?
So fusion voting is a pretty simple idea, honestly. It is basically the idea that, and this practice, that more than one party can nominate the same candidate, right? And that those nominations are listed on the ballot so that when a voter goes to vote on the ballot, they can pick the candidate that they prefer, but they can do so on the line of the party that is closest to their views. Right. So a candidate may be nominated by, a major party and a minor party. And a voter may go into the voter booth and say, what, I like this candidate, but the major party platform, I cannot get on board with that. But this minor party, whose view I do agree with or agree more with, right, has also nominated this candidate. And so I am going to check my ballot on that line. And that way the candidate will not just know that I voted for them, but they will also know why I voted for them, right? What my expectations are and what, again, accountability and responsiveness, what responsiveness would mean to earn my vote again in the future. So it communicates a lot more information as a ballot practice. Historically, this was really common practice in the United States. So in the 19th century, you had minor parties, some at very local levels, some at national levels, who used this system precisely because our winner-take-all election can make it very hard for third parties to kind of get in on the political space, right? It favors those two major parties, and that is not a new occurrence, right? That was true 150 years ago as well. But what fusion allowed was it allowed smaller parties who had typically a distinct identity, a distinct set of issues that they cared a lot about, to also nominate major party candidates and to build political power in that way, because they were often rooted in local communities or existing communities that cared about particular issues. And so they could mobilize voters. And with the use of fusion, they could also demonstrate to candidates that they weren't just a sideshow, right? That they were bringing meaningful numbers of voters with them. And this isn't sort of a footnote or a coda to the history of politics in the United States, right? The anti-slavery movement used fusion, among other sort of electoral strategies, to help build their power base, right? And move from sort of a moral and a social movement into a real political force that eventually then, contributes to giving birth to the Republican Party. The Populists, or the People's Party, after the Civil War, builds tremendous political power, oftentimes using fusion. And in places, they built so much power using fusion that one of the major parties would not cross-nominate their candidates.
Yeah.
Right. So it can be a two-way street. It's not determined like you are major party, you are minor party. And so it's this really powerful tool that becomes a way that people who don't fit into the two-party system
so
can then participate and influence.
Right, for sure. I think let's bring it down to the kitchen table level for people. One of the striking things about American history is that many of the things that we take for granted now, reforms that were enacted over the decades, for example, eliminating child labor, the 40-hour work week, the direct election of senators, that many of these were not issues that were initiated by one of the major parties. They were originally smaller parties that that sort of found an issue that was being neglected or ignored, elevated it to the point that people were supporting them, and then the major parties co-opted those movements. They said, okay, yes, of course, we're against child labor too. And that's why minor parties, I think that's one of the arguments that scholars make about the value of minor parties, even when they, without being able to use fusion, can't organize sufficiently well to stay viable, that they can only be spoilers, but that they still are a pressure release valve, that they allow neglected constituencies and neglected people to get their ideas out. So here we are today in a two-party doom loop, like our friend Lee Drutman likes to say. What do you think? What if we did open the system up with fusion? What kind of parties or movements do you think we would get? Like, what else would sort of start to sprout? Why would I make the case for why somebody should be excited about this? Basically, what would you get that you're not getting now?
Right. I think you get a lot more choices, first off. I think that you would get a way to, as I said before, vote in a way, again, where you could vote authentically in a way that matters, right? Because right now, if I have to choose, right now, if I go into the voting booth and I have one party who nominates a candidate I can tolerate, but the platform of that party for moral reasons or whatever values or my strongly held views, I cannot support that party. And the other party who maybe their platform I can more support, but there's something about the candidate where I just I cannot vote for that candidate. Like you're very stuck. With Fusion, you get to say, be part of a minor party that can build influence on issues you care about, that if they get, say, as you say, co-opted by a major party, great. But one of the things that fusion parties do is they also build organizations. A lot of times when we think about third parties right now, we think about like celebrity candidates who start a movement around themselves, right? That's like, I'm a political scientist. That is not institution building. That's not organization building. Fusion parties have an incentive to not do that. They have an incentive to build an organization that is in touch with people, that works with people, right? So if you look at the most successful fusion parties in history, that like nobody waved a wand and they like emerged in a puff of glitter, right? The Free Soil Party builds on the legacy of the anti-slavery movement, right? And the abolitionist movement. The Populist Party builds on the Grange and the Farmers Alliances, right? Organizations that existed because there was a demand in communities and a need for them because issues were not being addressed by the system as it existed.
Right. So we might have a
right. And so,
sorry to interrupt you. We might have something like a tenants party, for example, for all the people who can't afford the rent or something.
It could be. I mean, I think the thing about fusion is that it is a market improvement in a sense. It allows the political market to be more responsive to what people want in ways that our two-party system just cannot on its own do. So you might get folks who have common interests around, as you say, like a tenants party or a cost of living party, or you might get something totally different, right? And you might get moderate parties, right? That say, look, the two parties are, pulling in opposite directions. I'm very middle of the road. Maybe then you get that party. And fusion allows the political market in that sense to be responsive to people so that they feel like their vote matters and they have an impact and they're not just getting drowned out by the, whatever is the loudest voice of the day.
Got it. And then just to close it up, how does this then strengthen a movement for real proportional representation? Why do you see fusion as a stepping stone?
Yeah, I think fusion has benefits all on its own. Like, I don't want to minimize this. It's really what we've been talking about the whole time. But if we think back to the lessons that we get globally from proportional representation, it's that popular dissatisfaction with the current system matters. That popular dissatisfaction does not translate into real systemic reform on the level that a change to proportional representation would be, unless the major dominant parties don't have such a firm hold on the entire political landscape. There have to be cracks. There has to be something to channel that dissatisfaction to organize it, to sustain it in a direction that is comprehensible and that is actionable, right? Such as a reform for proportional representation. And what fusion would do is create the space and the ability for more minor parties to grow, to flourish, to build skills and organization and relationships with communities in ways that they could then be the vehicle that would push for reform in that way.
And just to be very precise, I wish I had thought of this question beforehand. Does this require a constitutional amendment, or this is really any state could just do this? I mean, we have fusion in New York and Connecticut, but other than that, I mean, does it is there any constitutional obstacle? Can the Supreme Court
Not,
get involved? Okay. So,
there is no constitutional obstacle. This is fusion and PR, frankly.
mhm,
Fusion is a state level issue. We don't have fusion except in New York and Connecticut
mhm.
because the states banned it because the major parties didn't like having to deal with the competition.
Right,
Um,
right.
so these are matters of state statute. So
Okay.
it's changeable. It does not require constitutional change.
And multi-member districts, same thing. One state could choose to do this, pave the way. We don't need this to happen all at once everywhere.
So for state legislatures,
Mhm,
a state would be able to do this for a state legislature.
mhm.
At the federal level, if we were talking about congressional districts, there is a federal statute that would need to be amended. But again, it's a statute.
Uh-huh.
It's not a constitutional change.
Right, right. Wow. So you're letting us imagine a future that could realistically happen in the next 5 to 10 years. We could begin to see this. And even if it only happened in a couple of places, given the way the rest of the political landscape feels like a desert, if just a few places become oasis of change, places where people are seeing an alternative that is more exciting and more interesting and more representative, then in theory, this could spread. This is what gives you optimism about the idea.
Certainly, it is one of the things that gives me optimism about the idea.
Mhm.
Also because there is a lot more diversity in the way that Americans have done democracy, right? And are doing democracy now in terms of how we run our elections than I think we all appreciate. We have a
Mm.
much more diverse heritage than we realized. And I think that we should sort of open up the scope of our understanding about what is possible. Um, and we don't, we can learn a lot of lessons from overseas, but we don't actually have to look that far to
Yeah,
sort of feed that imagination.
great, great. Well, looking forward to your paper being out. And as I said, we're going to put it in the show notes. Um, so I've been asking the same question of everybody when they come on the show, including when your colleague Ian Basson was on, which is, this is very hard work that you're doing, and right now the hill that we're climbing seems to get steeper and steeper, and the clouds above us are getting darker and darker. So how do you, just personally, Jennifer, what's your secret to staying relatively sane and optimistic, or at least, how do you do it? What gives you hope?
So before I joined Protect Democracy, I was in academia. And in that, my research specialty was in democratization and democratic politics after major armed conflict.
Mm,
Um, and so when I am looking for hope, I come back to that work a lot. Um,
mm,
because it gave me the chance to encounter people who were trying to build democracy under almost impossible circumstances. And
mhm,
the courage and the faith that they had in their own positions and their own circumstances, I find really inspiring. And I find a great source of hope because if they can sustain courage and hope in their contexts, then I think certainly, the rest of us should have good reason to sustain courage and hope here as well.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's very inspiring. Thank you. Thank you. And I really appreciate your work. Looking forward to seeing this report get out into the world and see how it ripples, and hopefully in 5 to 10 years we'll be able to say, well, it started here. Um, well, thank you, Jennifer. Well, that's it for this episode of This Old Democracy. If you found today's conversation thought-provoking, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our work and our partners at the Center for Ballot Freedom, visit centerforballotfreedom.org. I'm Micah Sifry, and I'll be back soon with more stories of the people and the ideas fighting to renew, repair, and rebuild this old democracy, because it's ours and it's worth saving. Thanks for listening. Stay engaged.